Hello and welcome to another AP Biology video. In this one, we are going to finally start talking about cellular respiration. So we all know that life is hard work, but right now we are talking about cellular work. And living cells require energy from outside sources in order to be able to do this work. So animals can obtain this energy by feeding on other animals, or they can feed on photosynthetic organisms. What? What do you mean? Well, I've talked about sea slugs once, and I will talk about them again. So this little adorable thing is also known as a sea sheep, and it actually eats so much algae that it's able to retain the chloroplast from those algae and actually photosynthesize itself. Wild. But we usually have something that looks more like this, where light energy comes into an ecosystem by the sun, into the chloroplasts of plants, which then photosynthesize, producing organic molecules and oxygen that then are able to be used in cellular respiration within our mitochondria. Our mitochondria finally produces ATP, which allows us to do most of our cellular work. Other energy is lost from these ecosystems as heat. So the general equation for cellular respiration is an organic compound plus oxygen makes carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And I say organic compounds because carbohydrates, fats, and proteins can all be used as fuel. We eat all of those things. But what's really useful for studying cellular respiration is using glucose. The math works out nicely, and we also get to go through all of the steps if we look at sugars. This process is exergonic, so it has a negative delta G and is spontaneous. And our products are going to store less energy than our reactants. Now, how does the breakdown of glucose and other fuels actually give us energy? It all has to do with the transfer of electrons during chemical reactions. So we're going to talk more in the next few slides about these transfer of electrons. But right now, just know that it releases energy that's ultimately used to synthesize ATP. Here, we can see magnesium donating its electrons to oxygen. So these chemical reactions that transfer electrons are called redox reactions. Redox, reduction, oxidation. So in reduction, a substance is going to gain electrons. Now, that might sound counterintuitive, but it helps to think about the charges. So electrons have negative charges, and whenever the electrons are transferred in a chemical reaction, the product that receives those electrons is now experiencing reduction. It's experiencing a reduction in charge. Let me say that again. The electrons have a negative charge, and whenever those are donated to a product, that product's charge is now decreasing and experiencing a reduction. In oxidation, a substance is losing its electrons, or it's oxidized. So let's look at this example. This is just a general equation of redox reactions. So this X reactant has the electrons, but it becomes oxidized, meaning it loses its electrons. And this Y reactant becomes reduced, which means it gains electrons. If you are having a hard time remembering that, then you can use this little, what do they call them? Mnemonic? Oil rig. So oxidation is loss of electrons and reduction is gain of electrons. So let's look at this example. Here, our sodium is losing its electrons. It becomes oxidized. And our chlorine is becoming reduced, meaning it gains an electron. The reducing agent becomes oxidized. So here, our sodium is our reducing agent. And our oxidizing agent becomes reduced. So here, our chlorine is our oxidizing agent. Now, how is it decided which atom is the oxidizing agent and which atom is the reducing agent? Well, it all has to do with electronegativity. So the more electronegative the atom, the harder it is to pull an electron away from it. We can see the trend of electronegativity on the periodic table here. So it shows us that fluorine is actually the most electronegative atom. It almost has a full valence electron shell, but our bodies use oxygen. Oxygen is a really, really strongly electronegative atom, and our bodies are able to utilize that. So what redox reactions are actually involved with cellular respiration? Well, the fuel, which is usually glucose, but we also can talk about other macromolecules, are oxidized. And then oxygen is reduced. And this oxidation of glucose, which is transferring electrons from the glucose to oxygen, transferring the electrons from a higher energy state to a lower energy state, frees up energy that then becomes available for ATP synthesis. So we can see the redox reaction of cellular respiration here. Our glucose is becoming oxidized and our oxygen is becoming reduced. So the foods that yield the most energy for us are carbohydrates and fats, and that is because they store a lot of electrons in between these carbon and hydrogen atoms. Now, the only thing that's holding back these electrons from moving to a lower energy state is a activation energy. Without this barrier, without this activation energy barrier, glucose would just instantly combust, kind of like what is happening here in the sugarcane field. Now, lucky for us, our body temperature is not high enough to initiate this burning. So our body requires enzymes, which lowers the activation energy and allows this sugar to finally become oxidized, releasing energy. So just like your car can't harness all of the energy from the gas tank at once, your body and other organisms' bodies are not able to harness all of the energy from the breakdown of glucose at once. So glucose is breaking down in a series of steps, and each of these steps is catalyzed by a specific enzyme. So this enzyme is going to strip away electrons from glucose, and then each of those electrons are going to travel with a proton. A proton plus an electron, that's hydrogen. So these hydrogen atoms are not directly transferred to oxygen, but first have to be passed on to an electron carrier. An electron carrier who? Well, we are talking about NAD+. NAD+ is well suited for this job of receiving these hydrogen atoms that are stripped from glucose because it's able to easily cycle in between its oxidized form NAD+ and its reduced form NADH. So here you are able to see the new hydrogen atom that is associated with NADH. And each molecule of this NADH represents stored energy, chemical energy, that then is able to be tapped to synthesize ATP. So think again about our divers going up and down the diving board. Right now, our NADH has a lot of this stored potential chemical energy. Now, how does our NAD+ actually trap the electrons from food? Well, kind of trick question there because NAD+ doesn't do it itself. It has the help of enzymes. So our enzyme here is dehydrogenase, which looks like this. Dehydrogenase is going to be removing a pair of electron atoms, so that's 2 electrons and 2 protons from glucose. So now glucose is oxidized. It's going to then, dehydrogenase is going to then deliver 2 electrons and 1 proton to its coenzyme NAD+, which is then going to form NADH. So NAD+ and NADH are a great power couple. Now, notice I said that only 1 proton is donated. That is because the other proton is going to be released as a hydrogen ion into the surrounding solution. Maybe that hydrogen ion is going to do something for our cell later on. What could it be? I'll leave you to think about it. Okay, so now we have gotten the electrons off of glucose. They're stored on NADH, but how do those electrons finally reach oxygen? Well, let's think about the reaction between hydrogen and oxygen to make water. This is a reaction that's actually used to power rockets, or one of the reactions that's used to power rockets. So if we mix together H2 and O2 and then provide a spark for the activation energy, then the gases will combine explosively. And then this explosion releases energy as the electrons fall closer to the electronegative oxygen atoms. Well, cellular respiration also brings hydrogen and oxygen to form water, but there's some differences, of course, between the rocket example and what's actually happening inside of our cells. So the hydrogen that reacts with the oxygen, of course, comes from our food and not from hydrogen gas. And then respiration doesn't occur in a single explosion, but instead uses a series of energy releasing steps to transfer the electrons to oxygen. Series of energy releasing steps? What are we possibly talking about? If you said the electron transport chain, then you guessed it. So our NADH electron carrier is going to pass those electrons to oxygen through the electron transport chain. So what is the electron transport chain? Well, it's made of a lot of different molecules, but mostly proteins, and it's built into the inner mitochondrial membrane. Or in prokaryotes, it's in the plasma membrane. So the electrons removed from glucose are shuttled by NADH to the higher energy of the chain. A lot of people call that the top of the chain. And then O2, oxygen, is sitting at the bottom. And because it is so electronegative, it's going to be pulling electrons down the chain of redox reactions in this like kind of energy tumble. So then each of these tumbles down the hill happens because the carrier down the hill is more electronegative than the carrier up the hill. And in each of these downhill energy yielding steps, we're able to harness that energy and then use it to later regenerate ATP. So now that we understand the redox reactions that are involved in transferring electrons from glucose to its final electron acceptor, oxygen, let's go ahead and take a look at the stages of cellular respiration. So, of course, we want to be harvesting our energy from glucose or some other organic fuel. And this has three main stages. So first, we have to split our sugar. Sugar splitting, or glycolysis, breaks down glucose into two molecules of pyruvate. Our 6-carbon glucose is being broken down into two molecules of 3-carbon pyruvate. Next, those molecules of pyruvate enter the citric acid cycle. And once those are broken down, we have now completed the breakdown of glucose. Next is oxidative phosphorylation, which encompasses both the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. These together account for most of our ATP synthesis. So here is just another quick overview of cellular respiration. We can see that in each step there are electron carriers taking electrons to the oxidative phosphorylation step, taking it to the electron transport chain. Our glucose in glycolysis is broken down into two pyruvates, which then are oxidized and enter the citric acid cycle. Electron carriers from the citric acid cycle are then also able to enter oxidative phosphorylation, and through electron transport and chemiosmosis, most of our ATP is able to be generated in this step for a total of 30 to 32 ATP. We will get more into all of those details in the next video, so thanks for joining me on this one.